The wind cut like knives that night in Montana. She couldn't feel her own hands anymore, only the tiny body pressed to her heart. Too still, too cold, too light for a little girl who should be running and laughing. 7 long days with nothing but snow to eat. 7 days since those bright eyes had opened wide, since that small voice had called, "Mama." She sank to her knees in the drifts, kissed the frost on her daughter's cheek, and breathed the only words left inside her. "Lord, if this is the end, please take us together." That's when she heard it, soft paws on snow, a low, gentle woof, and the creak of an old wagon stopping right beside her. If you want to meet the silver-haired woman and the big golden dog who refused to let 2 strangers freeze that night, pull your blanket up, settle in, and stay with me to the very last whisper. Hit subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. The porch light is on, and the story is just beginning. The winter of 1898 came down on Cedar Hollow, Montana, like judgment itself. Snow didn't fall so much as it poured, thick, wet, and relentless, turning the dirt streets into a white river that swallowed boots and wagon wheels alike. The temperature had not climbed above 0 in 3 weeks. Chimneys smoked all day and all night, but the wind snatched the heat before it ever reached the ground. Folks said it was the coldest stretch anyone could remember, the kind that killed cattle in the fields and froze the breath in your lungs if you stayed outside too long. On the edge of town, where the last lantern gave up its fight against the dark, a young woman staggered through the drifts with a child in her arms. She was 26, though the last year had added 10 more to her face. Her name was Ruth Harper, once a schoolteacher with a quick laugh and soft brown curls. Now the curls were matted under a threadbare shawl, her cheeks hollow, her lips cracked and bleeding. Her boot, once navy wool, had turned gray with ash and ice. The little girl she carried was her daughter Sadie, 5 years old, wrapped in every scrap of blanket Ruth owned. Sadie weighed almost nothing anymore. 7 days without real food had done that. The child's eyes stayed closed, lashes crusted white, and her breathing came in tiny puffs that barely stirred the frost on Ruth's neck. Ruth had knocked on every door she knew, and on plenty she didn't. She had begged at the church, at the saloon, at the mercantile. She had offered to wash floors, mend shirts, read letters, anything. The answers were always the same: heads shaking behind frosted windows, voices calling out that times were hard for everyone, that charity began at home. One woman had slipped her half a cold biscuit through a cracked door and whispered, "I'm sorry," before shutting it again. That biscuit had been gone 3 days ago. Now, Ruth's legs shook so badly she had to lean against the side of the general store just to stay upright. The windows glowed yellow, warm, and cruel. Inside, she could see shapes moving, hear muffled laughter, smell wood smoke and coffee and something baking. Her stomach cramped so hard she bent forward, afraid she would be sick, right there in the snow. Sadie made no sound. That silence was the worst part. A hungry child cries. A dying child goes quiet. Ruth slid down the wall until she sat in the drift, knees drawn up. Sadie cradled against her chest. Snow settled on them both like a blanket made of knives. She tried to pray, but the words tangled. All that came out was a whisper against her daughter's hair. "Lord, if this is the end, please take us together. Don't leave her alone." The wind answered with a howl that rattled the store's sign above her head. Somewhere down the street a horse snorted, restless in its traces. Ruth closed her eyes. She was so tired. Just a moment, she told herself. Just rest a moment. Snow crunched, slow and deliberate, right beside her. She opened her eyes, thinking she had dreamed it. But the crunch came again, and then a softer sound, 4 paws padding through the drift, and a low, worried whine that cut straight through the wind. A big golden dog stood not 3 feet away, head lowered, ears forward. He was old, muzzle gray, shoulders heavy with winter fur clumped with ice. One ear had an old tear, healed crooked. His eyes, warm amber in the lantern light spilling from the store window, never left Sadie's face. He took one careful step closer, sniffed the child's blanket, then looked up at Ruth and whined again, deeper this time, urgent. Ruth stared, too frozen to be afraid. "Go on," she croaked. "Ain't nothing here for you." The dog ignored her. He pressed his broad head against Sadie's tiny boot and gave another low, anxious sound, almost a plea. Behind him, the snow swirled and parted, and an old woman stepped into the circle of lantern light. She was tall and thin, wrapped in a man's heavy wool coat 2 sizes too big. Collar turned up around a wool scarf the color of storm clouds. Snow dusted her silver hair, pulled back in a braid thick as a rope. Her face was all angles and weather lines. Cheekbones sharp, mouth set firm, but her eyes, pale blue and clear as winter sky, held something Ruth had not seen in weeks. Simple human concern. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed her brow. Gloved hands clutched a lantern that swung gently, throwing gold across the snow. The old woman took in the sight, Ruth on the ground, Sadie limp in her arms, the golden dog standing guard, and her mouth tightened. She didn't gasp or fuss. She simply set the lantern down, knelt with the stiffness of age and cold, and touched 2 fingers to Sadie's neck. A long second passed. Then she nodded once, as if satisfied the child still lived. "Name's Abigail McKendrick," she said, voice low and rough from disuse, but steady. "Most folks call me Miss Abby. This here's Tucker." She rested a gloved hand on the dog's head. Tucker leaned into it without taking his eyes off Sadie. "He don't usually take to strangers, but he's decided you two belong to him now. I learned long ago not to argue with Tucker when he's made up his mind." Ruth tried to speak, managed only a cracked whisper. We got nowhere." "I see that." Miss Abby's gaze flicked over Ruth's torn boots, the threadbare shawl, the child's gray face. "Ain't right, leaving a mother and baby out here to freeze. Town's got hard hearts this winter." She paused, then added softer, "I know a thing or two about hard hearts." She stood, joints creaking, and offered one gloved hand. "My wagon's right there. House is 7 miles out. Warm fire, milk, broth. Tucker will ride in back with the little one if she needs watching. You don't have to beg, and you don't owe me a thing. Just come." Ruth stared at the hand, then at the old woman's face, then at Tucker, who had already lain down in the snow beside Sadie, pressing his warm bulk against the child, as if to share every bit of heat he had. Snow kept falling, the wind kept howling, but for the first time in 7 days, something besides cold touched Ruth's skin. The gentle nudge of a dog's nose, the quiet strength in an old woman's eyes. She took the offered hand. Miss Abby pulled her up with surprising strength, steadying her when her legs buckled. Tucker rose too, tail giving one slow wag, as if to say, "Good, let's go home." And somewhere behind them, the lantern on the store porch flickered once and went dark. The wagon was an old farm sled with high sides and a canvas top stretched tight against the wind. 2 sturdy bays stood hitched to it, steam curling from their nostrils, blankets thrown over their backs. Miss Abby lifted Sadie as gently as if the child were made of glass and laid her on a thick bed of straw and quilts in the back. Tucker hopped up without being asked, circled twice, and settled with his whole warm body pressed along Sadie's side. His big head rested on the child's chest, rising and falling with her shallow breaths. Ruth tried to climb in after them, but her legs gave out halfway. Miss Abby caught her under the arms the way a mother catches a toddler and boosted her up beside the quilts. "Easy now," the old woman murmured. "You're safe. Ain't nobody gonna hurt you tonight." Ruth collapsed against the straw, tears she didn't know she still had leaking from the corners of her eyes. Tucker licked one of them away, then laid his head back down with a soft huff, as if to say, "Cry if you need to, I've got the watch." Miss Abby climbed to the seat, gathered the reins, and clucked to the horses. The sled lurched forward, runners hissing over the snow. Cedar Hollow's last yellow window disappeared behind them, almost at once, swallowed by the storm. For a long while the only sounds were the creak of harness leather, the steady thud of hooves, and the wind worrying at the canvas overhead. Ruth lay on her side, one arm curled protectively around Sadie, the other buried in Tucker's thick fur. The dog's heartbeat was slow and strong against her palm, steady as a clock. She counted it the way other folks counted sheep, afraid to close her eyes in case this was all a dream that would vanish when she woke. Miss Abby spoke first, voice low so it wouldn't carry far over the wind. 7 miles ain't far when the road's clear. Tonight it'll feel like 70. You just rest. Tucker'll let me know if the little one needs anything." Ruth swallowed. Her throat felt lined with sand. "Why?" The word came out cracked and small. "Why are you doing this?" Miss Abby was quiet long enough that Ruth thought she wouldn't answer. When she did, her voice was matter of fact, the way folks talk about the price of flour. "Lost my own boy and my husband to the diphtheria back in '89. House got real big and real quiet after that. Tucker's the only one stuck around. She glanced over her shoulder, the lantern on the seat throwing soft gold across her lined face. Figure I got room for 2 more hearts that need warming, that's all. Ruth stared at the back of the old woman's wool coat, at the silver braid hanging beneath the hat brim, and felt something inside her chest crack open, something that had frozen solid weeks ago. The miles passed in white silence. Snow hissed against the canvas. The horses plodded on, heads low, trusting Miss Abby's hands on the lines. Every now and then Tucker would lift his head, sniff Sadie's face, and settle again with a contented sigh. Near the halfway mark, the sled topped a low rise and the wind hit full force. The canvas snapped like a sail. Ruth clutched Sadie tighter. The child stirred for the first time, a faint whimper escaping her lips. Tucker whined and licked the corner of Sadie's mouth. Miss Abby reached back without looking, found a tin flask under the seat, and passed it over. Go on. Warm milk and a little honey. I keep it for sick calves. Works on little girls, too. Ruth's hands shook so badly she could barely uncork it. She tipped a few drops between Sadie's lips. The child swallowed once, twice, then sighed and slipped back into sleep. Ruth drank what was left herself. It tasted like heaven and burned all the way down. Another hour, maybe 2, time had lost its edges. The sled tilted downward into a sheltered valley where the pines grew thick and the wind couldn't reach. Ruth smelled wood smoke long before she saw the light. Faint at first, then stronger, a steady glow through the trees. Miss Abby spoke again, softer now. Almost there. The ranch appeared like something out of a dream. A low log house with a wide porch, windows glowing warm amber, smoke curling straight up from a stone chimney because the pines broke the wind. A big barn loomed dark to the right, and beyond it is a corral where a couple of horses nickered welcome. The yard had been shoveled clear earlier that day. Fresh snow was already filling the path again, but the porch was swept clean, and a lantern hung beside the door, swinging gentle in the quiet air. Miss Abby drew the team to a stop. Tucker stood, stretched, and jumped down, then turned and waited, tail wagging slow and anxious. The old woman climbed down stiffly, came around to the back, and lifted Sadie as easily as she might lift a sack of feathers. The child's head lolled against her shoulder. Door's open, she told Ruth. You go on in, I'll bring the little one. Ruth stumbled down from the wagon, legs numb and prickling. The porch boards were solid under her feet, real, not snow and nightmare. She pushed the door open and stepped into a wave of heat and light that nearly buckled her knees. The kitchen was big and lived in. A cast-iron stove glowed cherry red in the corner, kettle humming. A rocking chair sat close to it, patchwork quilt folded neat on the seat. Braided rugs warmed the plank floor. On the table, a single oil lamp burned steady, and beside it sat a bowl of rising dough covered with a clean cloth. Everything smelled of yeast and pine, and coffee left too long on the stove. It smelled like someone lived here, really lived, not just survived. Tucker padded past her, shook snow from his coat, and went straight to a braided rug in front of the stove, where he turned 3 circles and lay down, eyes never leaving the doorway. Miss Abby came in carrying Sadie, boots leaving wet prints on the floor. She didn't pause, just crossed the room and pushed open a door Ruth hadn't noticed. Beyond it was a small bedroom, a real bed with a thick quilt and pillows that looked like clouds. A little wooden horse sat on the dresser, paint chipped but loved. Miss Abby laid Sadie down, pulled off the wet blankets, and wrapped her in warm flannel that had been hanging on a rack by the stove. Ruth stood frozen in the doorway, afraid to move, afraid it would vanish. Miss Abby turned, hands on hips. Soup's on in 10 minutes. You sit. I'll fetch dry clothes. She disappeared down a short hallway and came back with a soft flannel nightgown, big enough to swallow Ruth whole, and a smaller one that must have belonged to a child long ago. Ruth's tears started again, silent and unstoppable. Miss Abby pretended not to notice. She ladled thick beef broth into a mug, added a spoon of honey, and pressed it into Ruth's hands. Drink slow, then we'll wake the little one just enough for a few mouthfuls. Tucker'll stay right here. She nodded toward the dog, who had already claimed his spot at the foot of the bed, chin on his paws, amber eyes watchful. Ruth drank. The broth slid down like liquid sunlight, warming places inside her she'd forgotten existed. Outside, the storm kept raging, but in that small bedroom, with a golden dog guarding her daughter and an old woman moving quiet and sure about the kitchen, Ruth Harper felt the first stirrings of something she had almost forgotten: safety. Ruth woke to the smell of coffee and the soft pop of burning pine. For one terrifying heartbeat, she thought she was back on the street, that the warmth had been a cruel dream. But then she felt the weight of a real quilt across her shoulders and heard steady breathing beside her. Sadie lay curled on her side, cheeks flushed with sleep instead of cold, lips slightly parted. Tucker was still at the foot of the bed, head on his paws, but one ear flicked toward Ruth the moment she moved. He gave a low, happy thump of his tail against the rug, as if to say, "Good morning. She's still here. You're still here." Sunlight leaked around the edges of heavy curtains, pale and winter-thin, but sunlight all the same. Ruth sat up slowly. Every muscle ached, yet the ache felt clean, like the soreness after honest work, instead of the dull grind of despair. Her bare feet touched a braided rug softer than anything she had owned in years. On a chair beside the bed lay a stack of folded clothes: a warm wool skirt the color of coffee with cream, a man's flannel shirt softened by countless washings, thick socks darned neatly at the toes. Someone, Miss Abby, had laid them out while Ruth slept. She dressed quietly, rolling the shirt sleeves 4 times, then padded to the door. Tucker rose at once and followed, nails clicking softly on the pine floor. The kitchen greeted her like an old friend. The stove had been fed fresh wood. Its front glowed cherry red. A kettle murmured. On the table sat a blue-speckled enamel coffee pot, 2 mugs, and a plate covered with a clean tea towel. Miss Abby stood at the dry sink, back turned, rinsing something under the pump. She wore the same big coat as last night, but now it was unbuttoned, revealing a faded calico dress and a wool shawl pinned at the throat. Her silver braid hung forward over one shoulder as she worked. "Morning," she said without turning. "Coffee's hot. Help yourself. Little one still sleeping?" Ruth's voice came out rusty. "Yes, ma'am." Deep, like she hasn't in weeks. Miss Abby nodded once, set a bowl in the drain rack, and wiped her hands on a flour sack towel. Only then did she face Ruth fully. In daylight, her eyes were even bluer, set deep in a face mapped by sun and wind and sorrow. But this morning the sorrow was banked, like coals under ash. Good. Sleep knits the body together faster than anything else. She pulled the towel off the plate, 4 thick slices of warm soda bread, butter melting into them, and a small crock of blackberry jam. "Sit. Eat slow. Your stomach's shrunk." Ruth obeyed, legs shaky. The first bite of bread tasted so good it hurt. She had to look down so Miss Abby wouldn't see the tears. Tucker settled under the table with his head on Ruth's foot, a warm, solid weight that anchored her to the chair. Miss Abby poured coffee, black and strong, then took the chair opposite. She wrapped both hands around her mug as if warming them. For a long minute the only sounds were the stove's soft ticking and the wind worrying the eaves. Ruth found her voice. "I don't know how to thank you." "Don't need thanks," Miss Abby said. "Need you strong enough to help me with chores when the storm breaks. Got a cow needs milking twice a day, chickens to feed, wood to split. Idle hands make heavy hearts." Ruth managed a watery smile. "I was a school teacher. I can read, write, figure. I can cook, mend, garden." Miss Abby lifted one brow. "Can you milk a contrary Jersey cow named Delilah who kicks if you sing off key?" Ruth laughed, actually laughed, and it startled them both. Tucker's tail thumped approval. The bedroom door creaked. Sadie stood in the opening, barefoot, drowning in the too large flannel nightgown, one hand clutching the doorframe. Her curls were tangled, her cheeks pink, but her eyes were open and clear for the first time in weeks. "Mama?" The word was small, hoarse from disuse, but it was there. Ruth was out of her chair so fast she overturned it. She dropped to her knees and opened her arms. Sadie ran the 3 steps between them and buried her face in Ruth's neck. Ruth felt hot tears that weren't her own soak the collar of the borrowed shirt. Tucker padded over, tail sweeping the floor in wide, joyful arcs. He nosed Sadie's hand until she turned and wrapped both skinny arms around his neck. "Doggy," she whispered, awed. Tucker stood patient and proud, letting the child hang on him like a monkey. Miss Abby watched from the table, coffee forgotten. Something soft and painful crossed her face, gone almost before it arrived. She cleared her throat. "Well now, looks like somebody's ready for breakfast." She moved with quiet efficiency, a smaller mug of milk warmed with honey, a slice of bread torn into bite-sized pieces, a soft-boiled egg. Sadie ate slowly at first, then faster, eyes round as she discovered taste again. Ruth hovered, afraid to believe it was real. When the plate was clean, Sadie looked up at Miss Abby and said, "Clear as spring water. Thank you, ma'am." Miss Abby's hand froze halfway to the coffee pot. For a moment, the kitchen was perfectly still, except for the stove's gentle crackle. Then the old woman turned away, busied herself at the sink, but not before Ruth saw her swipe at her eyes with the heel of her hand. "Call me Miss Abby, child. Everybody does." Her voice was gruff, but it shook just a little. After breakfast, Miss Abby showed them the house, not as a tour, but the way you introduce old friends. The sitting room had a brick hearth big enough to stand in, a rag rug faded to soft blues and roses, and shelves of books worn soft at the corners. A boy's toy wagon, paint chipped but wheels still true, sat beneath the window. On the mantel rested a tintype in a simple wood frame. A younger Miss Abby, arm around a smiling man with a mustache, a sturdy boy of maybe 8 perched on a rail, fence between them. The boy's grin was missing 2 front teeth. Ruth's throat tightened. She understood now why the house felt both full and empty at the same time. The upstairs held 2 more bedrooms. One was Miss Abby's, plain iron bed, patchwork quilt in log cabin pattern, a single photograph of the same boy, older, perhaps 12, holding a fishing pole. The other had been his. Dust covers shrouded the small bed, but the covers had been pulled back recently, as if someone couldn't bear to keep it closed forever. A shelf of carved wooden animals, horses, dogs, a bear with one ear chewed, lined one wall. Sadie's eyes went wide. She reached for a golden dog that looked remarkably like Tucker and held it to her chest. Miss Abby watched from the doorway, arms folded tight. "Those were my boy Caleb's. He'd be 20 now, if the fever hadn't taken him and his pa both." She said it plain, like weather. "Toys don't do nobody good gathering dust. You play with them, little miss. They've been waiting a long time for small hands again." Sadie looked up, solemn. "I'll be careful." Miss Abby's mouth twitched, almost a smile. Caleb wasn't careful a day in his life, broke half of them himself, and loved the rest twice as hard. You do the same. Outside, the storm still raged, but inside the house something shifted, like ice breaking on a river in early thaw. Laughter, small and tentative, echoed down the hallway when Sadie discovered the wooden dog squeaked if you pressed its belly. Tucker barked once in delight and chased his tail in a circle. Ruth stood in the doorway of Caleb's room and felt the walls breathe around her. Memories, loss, and now the fragile beginning of new life. Downstairs, the stove popped again, sending up sparks. Miss Abby's voice drifted up, steady and kind. "Come on down when you're ready, girls. Got oatmeal simmering and a whole day ahead of us." Ruth took Sadie's hand, warm now, alive, and followed Tucker down the stairs toward the smell of breakfast and the promise of tomorrow. 3 weeks slid by like quiet breaths. The blizzard finally spent itself, leaving behind a world so white it hurt the eyes, and so still you could hear the snow settle. Days grew longer, the sun climbed higher, and the cold loosened its grip just enough for a body to step outside without freezing solid in 10 minutes. Inside Miss Abby's log house, life found a gentle rhythm. Morning started with the clang of the stove lid and the smell of oatmeal thick with cream and brown sugar. Sadie now sat at the table in a booster seat, made from an old crate, legs swinging, cheeks round again. She talked from the moment her eyes opened until the moment they closed, mostly to Tucker, who listened with grave attention and thumped his tail whenever she paused for breath. Ruth discovered she could milk Delilah the Jersey cow after only 2 kicked-over buckets and 1 bruised shin. She learned to gather eggs without waking the rooster, an evil-tempered bird named General Grant, to split kindling with a steady swing, and to bake soda bread that rose high and light. Her hands, once cracked and bleeding, healed smooth under Miss Abby's sharp-eyed care and generous daubs of bag balm. Afternoons belonged to the big kitchen table. Ruth spread Caleb's old primers and a slate, and taught Sadie her letters. The child traced ABC with a tongue tip of concentration, then rewarded herself by lining up the carved wooden animals in marching order while Tucker supervised from his rug. Evenings were for the fireside. Miss Abby rocked in the old hickory rocker, mending socks or shelling peas, while Ruth read aloud from David Copperfield or the Sears catalog, both counted as literature in Sadie's opinion. Tucker lay across all available feet, snoring soft dog dreams. One late February afternoon, the The sun came out fierce and golden, turning every icicle into a dagger of light. The snow on the south-facing barn roof began to drip in steady plinks into the stock tank. Miss Abby stood on the porch, hands on hips, studying the sky the way sailors study the sea. "Chinook's coming," she announced. "Warm wind off the mountains, be running water by tomorrow night." Ruth stepped out beside her, shawl around her shoulders. "Does that mean town?" Miss Abby didn't answer right away. She scratched Tucker behind the ears and watched Sadie trying to make a snowman with snow too dry to pack. The child had given up and was now drawing hearts in the crust with a stick while Tucker plowed alongside, tongue lolling. "Means the road'll be open," Miss Abby said finally. "Means folks can come looking if they want, or you can go if that's what you need." Ruth's heart lurched. Go where? She had no people left, no money, no plan beyond the next sunrise. The thought of leaving this warm house, this steady rhythm, this old woman who had become the closest thing to family either of them had known, it felt like stepping back into the blizzard. Before she could speak, Sadie's excited shout cut across the yard. "Look! Look, Mama! Miss Abby! Tucker found a flower!" They turned. The child was on her knees beside the south wall of the house where the snow had melted back to bare earth. Tucker stood over her, tail sweeping grand arcs, nose pointed proudly at the ground. Ruth hurried down the steps, Miss Abby right behind. There, in a patch no bigger than a dinner plate, a single snowdrop pushed up through the cold dirt. Its green stem was thin as thread, its white bell no larger than Sadie's thumbnail, but it was open, brave, and perfect. Sadie reached out, then snatched her hand back. "Can I pick it?" Miss Abby crouched, joints creaking. "Snowdrops are tough little things. They know when it's safe to come up. Let it stay a day or two. More will follow." Sadie nodded solemnly, and instead laid her mitten gently on the tiny flower, as if giving it a blessing. Tucker sniffed it once, sneezed, then flopped down in the damp earth like a golden rug, guarding the miracle. That night after supper, the Chinook arrived. Warm wind poured down the valley, roaring in the pines like distant surf. Snow slid from the barn roof in heavy slabs. Water dripped from the eaves in a steady silver curtain. They sat late by the fire. Sadie had fallen asleep on the settee with her head in Ruth's lap and one hand buried in Tucker's fur. The dog's eyes were half closed in bliss. Miss Abby poked the logs, sending up a shower of sparks. "I've been thinking," she said quietly. Ruth waited. "I got this place paid for. Stock's healthy. Garden spot's big enough for 3. There's a spare room upstairs that ain't been slept in proper since Caleb grew too big for it." She paused, staring into the flames. "I ain't asking for charity cases. I'm asking for help, permanent if it suits. I'm getting on in years and Tucker here won't be chasing calves forever." Ruth's throat closed. She looked down at Sadie's peaceful face, at Tucker's steady breathing, at the firelight flickering across the old woman's strong, lined features. "You'd be giving us a home," she whispered. Miss Abby gave a short nod. "And you'd be giving me back a family. Fair trade, far as I'm concerned." Silence settled, warm and full. Outside, the Chinook moaned around the eaves, melting winter away one drip at a time. Inside, the first snowdrop stood alone in its patch of bare earth, but it would not stand alone for long. Ruth reached across the space between the chairs and laid her hand over Miss Abby's work-roughened one. "We'd like to stay," she said, "if you'll have us." Miss Abby turned her palm up and closed her fingers tight. Then it settled. Her voice was gruff, but her eyes shone wet in the firelight. "Tomorrow we'll ride to town. File papers proper. Make it legal. Ruth Harper and Sadie Harper, of the McKendrick Ranch. Been a long time since this. Place had young voices in it." Sadie stirred in her sleep, murmured something that sounded like Tucker and home, and smiled. Tucker thumped his tail once, slow and certain. Above them, the warm wind kept blowing, carrying winter away on its back. And in the patch of bare earth by the house wall, the snowdrop lifted its small white head to the moon, the first brave promise that spring always comes, even after the longest, cruelest night. The trip to town was set for the first clear Friday in March. The Chinook had done its work. The road was a ribbon of mud and running water, the sky wide and blue, the mountains wearing only patches of white. Miss Abby hitched the bays to the light spring wagon, tucked hot bricks at their feet, and wrapped Sadie in so many quilts she looked like a bright-eyed caterpillar. Ruth wore her own mended coat now, but underneath was a new calico dress Miss Abby had quietly run up on the treadle machine after supper. Tucker rode in back as usual, head high, ears pricked, proud as any bodyguard. They reached Cedar Hollow just after noon. The street steamed in the sun. Children shouted and splashed in puddles that had been solid ice only days before. Folks stared openly. Miss Abby McKendrick, who hadn't come to town more than twice a winter for 10 years, riding down Main Street with a pretty young woman, a rosy-cheeked child, and that big golden dog sitting tall between them. Whispers followed the wagon like geese. First stop was the courthouse. Judge Whitaker, a kindly man with wire spectacles and a limp from Gettysburg, read the papers Miss Abby had ready. Petition for guardianship of minor child Sadie Harper, and for Ruth Harper to be named permanent hired help with room and board. He asked Ruth a few gentle questions, listened to Miss Abby's plain statement that these two belong with me now, and banged his gavel before the ink was dry. It was legal. They were family on paper as well as in heart. Sadie celebrated by feeding Tucker half her peppermint stick right on the courthouse steps. They were loading supplies at the mercantile, flour, sugar, a bolt of sky blue wool for Sadie's first real dress, when the shadow fell across the doorway. Harlan Greeley was the richest man in the county and the meanest when crossed. He owned the biggest saloon, half the mortgages in town, and a temper that had put more than one man in the ground. Tall, heavy through the chest, with a black beard going gray and eyes the color of dirty ice. He wore a long duster and a silver-topped cane he didn't need for walking. He blocked the light, looked the three of them over slow, then settled his gaze on Ruth. "Well now," he drawled, "if it ain't the widow Harper. Heard you crawled off to freeze with that young'un. Looks like the old witch found you first." He tipped his hat to Miss Abby with mocking courtesy. "Morning, Abigail. Still playing Lady Bountiful with other folks' scraps?" Miss Abby's face never changed. "Morning, Harlan. Step aside. We've got business." Greeley didn't move. His eyes flicked to Sadie, who had shrunk against Ruth's skirts, then to Tucker, whose lip lifted just enough to show one white fang. "I'll take the woman and the child off your hands," Greeley said, loud enough for the whole store to hear. "Got a place for pretty widows upstairs at the Silver Dollar. Good money. Child can earn her. Keep sweeping floors till she's old enough for better work." He smiled, yellow teeth in the black beard. "Be doing 'em a favor. Ranch life's too hard for tender things." Ruth felt every drop of blood leave her face. Memories of hungry nights and locked doors rushed back like poison. She stepped in front of Sadie. Miss Abby spoke so softly, only Greeley and Ruth could hear. "You lay one finger on either of them, and Tucker'll have your throat before you draw breath. Then I'll finish what he starts." Tucker growled, low thunder that rattled the canned goods on the shelves. Greeley's smile thinned. "Threats, Abigail? In front of the child?" "No threat," Miss Abby said. "Promise." The store owner, Mr. Jensen, cleared his throat nervously. "Harlan, these ladies are under my roof. Let's keep this civil." Greeley stared a moment longer, then shrugged as if it was nothing. "Offer stands, widow. Winter's long. Folks change their minds." He touched the brim of his hat again and sauntered out, cane tapping the boardwalk. The store felt colder after he left, even with the sun pouring through the windows. They finished loading in silence. On the way home, Miss Abby took a longer route, checking fences, giving everyone time to breathe. Sadie fell asleep against Tucker, one hand twisted in his fur. Ruth stared at the mountains until her eyes burned. Halfway up the valley, Miss Abby pulled the team to a stop, where the road crossed a little creek now running bankful with snowmelt. She set the brake and turned on the seat. "Listen to me, Ruth Harper." Her voice was steady steel. "That man's got money and he's got meanness, but he's got no claim on you or Sadie. Not legal, not moral, not one whit. Judge signed the papers. You're mine now, by law and by choice. And this ranch has stood against worse than Harlan Greeley for 50 years. Ruth swallowed hard. "He scares me." "He should. Coyotes scare sensible folks. Don't mean you open the door and invite 'em in for supper." Miss Abby reached over and took Ruth's cold hand. "We'll be ready. I got good neighbors, a good dog, and a good rifle. And I got you. That's 4 more than I had last month." Ruth managed a shaky laugh. Tucker licked her cheek as if sealing the bargain. They drove on. The sun sank behind the western ridge, painting the snow rose and gold. By the time the ranch came into view, lamps were already lit in the windows, smoke curling friendly from the chimney. Inside, the house smelled of venison stew and cornbread. Miss Abby hung her coat, rolled up her sleeves, and said nothing more about town. Instead, she told Sadie a long, silly story about the time Tucker chased a skunk clear to the next county and had to sleep in the barn for a week. Sadie giggled until she hiccuped, and Ruth felt the fear loosen its grip. Just a little. Later, after Sadie was tucked in with her wooden dog and the real one curled, at the foot of the bed, Ruth stood on the dark porch breathing cold, clean air. Miss Abby joined her, 2 mugs of coffee steaming between them. "He won't come tonight," Miss Abby said quietly. "Men like Greeley move slow when they're planning. Gives us time," Ruth nodded. "What do we do?" "We live," Miss Abby answered. "We plant the early peas, mend the chicken wire, teach Sadie to read big words. We make this place so full of life, he wouldn't dare touch it." She sipped her coffee. "And we keep the rifle loaded and Tucker fed. That's all any of us can ever do." Far off, a coyote yipped once, then fell silent. Tucker's ears pricked from inside the house, but he didn't bark. He knew the difference between empty noise and real danger. Ruth leaned her shoulder against Miss Abby's. The older woman didn't move away. Above them, the stars burned bright and cold, the same stars that had watched over frozen streets and locked doors only weeks ago. But tonight they looked different, like they were keeping watch for something gentler. Inside, the fire settled into quiet coals. Outside, spring crept closer, one melting drop at a time. And on the porch, 2 women and 1 old golden dog stood guard over a family that had already survived the worst winter could throw. The shadow had come, but it had not won. Not yet. Spring arrived all at once, the way it does in Montana. One morning the cottonwoods were bare gray sticks. The next they wore a green haze so tender it looked like hope made visible. The creek behind the barn roared brown with runoff. The meadowlarks sang from every fence post, and the air carried the sweet, almost unbelievable scent of lilacs from the big bush beside the porch. Inside the house, life had grown easy and loud in the best way. Sadie turned 6 on the 22nd of April. They celebrated with a cake Ruth baked in the shape of a dog, lopsided but Tucker approved. 3 candles, because that was all they had, and presents wrapped in brown paper. A real store-bought doll from Miss Abby, a picture book Ruth had ordered from the catalog, and a collar of soft red leather for Tucker, hand-tooled by the saddle maker in town. Sadie declared it the best birthday in the history of the world. Ruth's garden rows were already up. Peas, lettuce, radishes, and a long line of sunflowers Sadie insisted on planting. So, Tucker has something tall to lean against. The child followed the dog everywhere, chattering nonstop. Tucker accepted his new role as chief playmate, nurse, and occasional pony with patient dignity. When Sadie tired, she simply climbed onto his broad back, wrapped her arms around his neck, and napped while he carried her gently back to the house. Miss Abby watched it all with quiet wonder, as if someone had opened a window in a room that had been closed for 10 years and let sunlight pour in. One soft May evening, after the supper dishes were done, and Sadie was tucked in with her doll and her dog, Miss Abby led Ruth out to the porch. The lilacs were heavy with bloom. Their perfume drifted thick and sweet on the warm air. Miss Abby carried a small cedar box. She set it on the porch rail and opened the lid. Inside, on faded blue velvet, lay adoption papers already filled out in Ruth's careful schoolteacher hand, and witnessed by Judge Whitaker on their last trip to town. Beside them sat 2 simple gold bands, one adult size, one child. "I had the judge hold these quiet," Miss Abby said, voice low so it wouldn't carry through the open window. "Didn't want to rush you, but the garden's growing, the lilacs are blooming, and I find I'm tired of waiting for tomorrow to make things right." Ruth's breath caught. Miss Abby lifted the larger ring. "Ruth Harper, will you take my name and let me take yours? Will you be my daughter in the eyes of God in the territory of Montana, now and always?" Tears spilled before Ruth could stop them. She had been orphan, widow, beggar, stranger. Now this fierce, kind woman was offering the one thing she had never dared hope for again, a mother. "Yes," she whispered. "Oh, yes." Miss Abby slipped the ring onto Ruth's finger. It fit perfectly. She had measured while Ruth slept weeks ago. Then she took the tiny band. "And for Sadie, when she wakes in the morning, Ruth McKendrick and Sadie McKendrick. Sounds strong, don't it?" Ruth laughed through happy sobs. "It sounds like home." They stood there a long while, foreheads touching, lilacs brushing their hair with fragrance. Tucker sat beside them, tail sweeping the porch boards in slow, solemn beats, as if he understood every word. Later, when the moon rose silver over the meadows, Miss Abby brought out the second thing she had carried onto the porch, her late husband's Winchester rifle, cleaned and oiled until it gleamed. She laid it across the rocker and looked Ruth in the eye. "Family's official now," she said quietly. "That means we protect it. Harlan Greeley's been seen riding the county line more than once. Word is he's short on girls at the Silver Dollar and nursing a grudge." Ruth's joy dimmed, but did not die. "What do? We do what women have always done," Miss Abby replied. "We work, we love, we live loud enough to drown out fear, and we keep the rifle handy." She picked it up, worked the lever smooth and sure. "I can still put 5 shots in a knothole at 100 yards. Age hasn't taken that yet. And Tucker's nose is better than any watchdog in the territory." She handed the rifle to Ruth. "Your turn tomorrow. Caleb started learning at 8. You're a quick study." Ruth took the weight of it, cold steel and warm wood, and felt something settle inside her. Not fear, but readiness. The next morning, Sadie woke to find the little gold ring on her finger and Miss Abby kneeling by the bed. "Morning, Miss Sadie McKendrick," the old woman said gruffly. "How does it feel to have a grandma who's been waiting her whole life for you?" Sadie stared, mouth round, then flung herself into Miss Abby's arms with a squeal that brought Ruth running from the kitchen. There were tears and laughter and pancakes with huckleberry syrup, and Tucker got extra bacon for being the first to know the secret. That afternoon, they planted the lilac starts Miss Abby had rooted the year Caleb died. 12 small sticks she had never had the heart to set out. Now each woman carried one, Sadie too, and together they put them in a circle around the porch, a living promise. When the last one was tamped in, Miss Abby stood back, hands on hips, eyes shining. "Circle of lilacs," she said, "means nobody gets in or out without smelling how sweet this family is." Sadie giggled and ran to hug Tucker, who tolerated the sticky syrup on her fingers with noble resignation. In the evenings after that, when the light lingered long and golden, Ruth practiced with the Winchester behind the barn. Miss Abby stood beside her, correcting stance and breathing, praising every tight group that punched the target. Tucker lay in the grass chewing a stick, ears cocked for praise. And every night, before sleep, the 3 of them, 4 counting Tucker, gathered in the kitchen. Miss Abby read a chapter from the Big Family Bible, voice steady and low. Then Sadie said her prayers, always ending the same. "Thank you, God, for Mama, for Grandma Abby, for Tucker, and for making us a real family forever and ever. Amen." Ruth and Miss Abby added soft amens of their own. Outside, the lilacs grew taller by the day, and the scent drifted through the open windows like a blessing. Harlan Greeley's shadow still waited somewhere beyond the hills, patient and poisonous. But inside the circle of lilacs, inside the circle of arms and hearts and one old golden dog, love had taken root deeper than any darkness could reach. Spring had come, and it was armed with cookies, bedtime stories, and a well-oiled rifle. They were ready. July heat baked the valley by day and left the nights soft and heavy with the smell of cut hay. The lilacs had given way to wild roses along the creek, and the garden was a green jungle of beans, corn, and towering sunflowers that Sadie swore leaned over every morning to kiss Tucker good day. They had almost begun to believe the danger was only a bad memory. Then, on a Thursday when thunderheads piled black against the mountains, Harlan Greeley made his move. It started with the dogs. Tucker had been restless all afternoon, pacing the porch, ears pricked toward town, growling low at nothing Ruth could see. Miss Abby watched him the way old sailors watch gulls and said only, "Storm's coming, and not the kind that brings rain." By supper, the sky was the color of a fresh bruise. Sadie ate quickly and asked to sleep in the big bed with Mama and Grandma. "Just in case the thunder gets scared." They let her. Tucker refused his usual spot on the rug and planted himself in the hallway, facing the front door, a silent golden sentinel. At 10:30, the first knock came, 3 hard raps that rattled the windows. Miss Abby was already pulling on her boots. Ruth reached for the Winchester above the mantel. Tucker's growl rolled out like distant thunder of his own. Miss Abby lit the lamp low, opened the door just wide enough to see, and leveled the rifle through the crack. Harlan Greeley stood on the porch with 4 men behind him. Rain had started, hard mountain rain that hissed on the tin roof and turned the yard to mud. Lantern light caught on the silver handle of his cane and the wet barrels of 2 shotguns. "Evening, Abigail," Greeley called, voice oily under the storm. Heard tell you got something that belongs to me. Miss Abby didn't flinch. Only thing here that belongs to you is the memory of the day you learned manners. Greeley laughed, but it was thin. Widow Harper owes me money from before you took her in. Interest adds up. I'm here to collect, one way or another. Ruth stepped up beside Miss Abby, rifle steady in her hands now. I owe you nothing, Harlan Greeley. Judge Whitaker saw the books. You were paid in full when my husband died. Greeley's eyes narrowed. Paper don't mean much out here after dark. One of his men shifted, shotgun rising. Tucker exploded. He came through the narrow opening like golden lightning, teeth bared, a roar that belonged to something twice his size. The nearest man yelled and stumbled back off the porch into the mud. Tucker hit the second man chest high, bowled him over, and stood on him snarling, rain streaming off his coat. Miss Abby's rifle spoke once, sharp and flat over the storm. The lantern in Greeley's hand shattered, plunging the porch into darkness lit only by lightning. Next one takes a knee, she said calmly. Then we talk about trespassing and attempted kidnapping in front of the circuit judge come August. Ruth's voice rang out beside her, stronger than she had ever dreamed she could be. Get off our land, Harlan. You are not welcome here. You will never be welcome here. Thunder crashed directly overhead. For a heartbeat, the yard lit up white. 5 men, 1 furious dog, 2 women with rifles, and the circle of lilacs bending in the wind. Greeley wiped rain from his beard, eyes hateful slits. This ain't over, old woman. Miss Abby worked the lever on the Winchester, chambering another round with a sound like a promise. It is tonight. Tucker advanced 1 step, lips peeled back, every tooth showing. The men looked at their boss, looked at the dog, looked at the black muzzles pointed their way, and suddenly decided other places needed them more. They backed down the steps, dragging the man Tucker had flattened. Horses waited in the dark. Hooves churned mud as they mounted and rode off, swallowed by the rain. The storm raged another hour. Inside, Sadie never woke. She slept curled between Ruth and Miss Abby, Tucker's head across her feet like a living hot water bottle. When the rain finally eased to a whisper, Miss Abby lit the lamp again and checked the yard. Hoofprints led away toward town and did not come back. Ruth stood on the wet porch, rifle still in her hands, shaking now that it was over. Miss Abby laid an arm around her shoulders. You did good, daughter, real good. Ruth leaned into her, tears mixing with rain. I was so scared. Fear kept your hands steady, Miss Abby said. That's what it's for. Tucker shook himself like a wet bear, spraying water everywhere, then trotted inside and checked on Sadie before flopping down with a huge dog sigh. Dawn came pale and clean-washed. The storm had left the air sweet, the mountains sharp against a sky-scrubbed blue. Meadowlarks sang as if nothing had happened. They ate breakfast in quiet triumph. Hot cakes, bacon, coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe. Sadie woke full of questions about the big thunder dog and declared Tucker the bravest hero in Montana. Later that morning, the sheriff rode out, hat in hand, apologies on his lips. Word had reached town before daylight. Half the county had heard the shotgun blast and seen Greeley's men ride in soaked and spooked. The sheriff took statements, measured the shattered lantern with a tape, and promised charges by noon. Harlan Greeley was arrested before supper, bound over for trial on counts too numerous to list before breakfast. The silver dollar closed its doors for good 3 days later when the bank called in his notes. The circle of lilacs bloomed heavier than ever that summer, as if the storm had watered them with something stronger than rain. One August evening, when the hay was in and the first cool breath of autumn touched the air, the 3 of them, 4, counting Tucker, sat on the porch swing watching the sun sink red behind the mountains. Sadie leaned against Miss Abby's side and asked, Grandma, are the bad men all gone now? Miss Abby smoothed the child's curls. Gone far enough, little one, and they won't be back. Ruth rested her head on Miss Abby's other shoulder. Because we stood together. Because we stood together, Miss Abby agreed. And because love, when it finally gets its feet under it, is the strongest thing on earth. Tucker laid his graying muzzle across all 3 laps and sighed the deep, satisfied sigh of a dog whose job is done. Fireflies winked on and off above the meadow. Somewhere a coyote sang to the rising moon, but it sounded lonely now, not threatening. The porch swing creaked gentle and steady, rocking 4 hearts that had learned, in the space of 1 long winter and 1 fierce summer storm, Exactly what family means. 10 quiet years slipped by the way good years do, soft as quilt batting, bright as meadowlarks. The lilac circle around the house grew thick and tall, a living wall of purple and green that hummed with bees every May. Inside it, the ranch changed only in the sweetest ways. The garden doubled in size. A swing hung from the cottonwood for Sadie, then for the babies who came after. The porch got fresh white paint every other spring, and the old swing was sanded smooth again and again by loving hands. Tucker lived to the grand age of 15, gray as winter frost all over, slow to rise in the mornings, but still the gentle king of the place. When his hind legs finally gave out, Miss Abby carried him to his favorite sunny spot on the porch every morning and back inside every night. He died on a golden September afternoon, head in Sadie's lap, Ruth's hand on his heart, Miss Abby stroking his ears, whispering the same words she had used the night she found him as a half-starved pup. "Good boy. You did real good." They buried him under the biggest lilac with his red collar and a soup bone he never got to finish. Sadie, 16 now, and taller than Ruth, cried like the little girl she once was. Ruth and Miss Abby cried too, but softer, the way grown women do when they know some losses are the price of deep love. The next spring, a new golden puppy arrived, a great-grandson of Tucker's, with the same amber eyes and the same crooked ear. Sadie named him Boone, because every good story needs a second chapter. Years turned. Ruth married a kind rancher from the next valley, a quiet man named Thomas who loved books and children and never once raised his voice. They built a small house just across the meadow, so Ruth could still walk to Miss Abby's kitchen every morning. Sadie grew into a tall, laughing girl, with her mother's brown curls and her grandmother's steady blue eyes. She rode like the wind, taught school in Cedar Hollow 3 days a week, and still came home every night to the ranch that had saved her life. Miss Abby's hair went from silver to snow white, but her back stayed straight and her hands strong. She taught every grandchild who came along how to milk Delilah's great-granddaughter, how to shoot straight, and how to listen to a dog when he tells you something with his eyes. And the porch swing kept rocking. On a late summer evening in 1908, the sun hung low and red over the mountains, the same color it had been the night Harlan Greeley rode away forever. The air smelled of fresh-cut hay and lilacs still blooming late. Crickets tuned up in the grass. A soft breeze moved the cottonwood leaves like gentle applause. Miss Abby sat in the swing, 82 years old and beautiful with it. Her calico dress was faded, her silver braid thick as ever. On her lap slept little Ellie, Ruth's youngest, 4 years old and named for the grandmother who had chosen her mother out of a blizzard. Ruth, gray threading her own curls now, sat beside her mother, rocking slow. Sadie, 26 and soon to be married herself, leaned against the porch post with Boone's big golden head in her lap. Thomas was in the barn finishing chores. 2 older grandchildren chased fireflies across the yard, laughing. The swing creaked its familiar song. Miss Abby looked out over the meadow, past the lilacs, past the garden, still giving tomatoes and sunflowers tall as a man. Her eyes were misty but clear. "Funny," she said softly, "how one cold night can change everything forever." Ruth rested her head on Miss Abby's shoulder, the way she had the first night they became mother and daughter. "You changed everything," she answered. "You and Tucker." Miss Abby smiled, the small private smile that had once been so rare and now came easy. "No, darlin', you and that little girl changed me. I was just an old woman with an empty house and a good dog. You brought the house back to life." Sadie spoke from the steps, voice thick with happy tears. "Tucker always said we belonged to him first." They laughed quietly, the sound warm as the sun set. Little Ellie stirred, sat up sleepy-eyed, and patted Miss Abby's cheek. "Gamma, tell the story again." Miss Abby gathered the child close. "Which one, sugar?" "The one where the big dog found Mama and Sadie in the snow and brought them home." Miss Abby looked at Ruth, then at Sadie, then at Boone dozing with one ear cocked, listening the same way his great-grandsire used to. So she told it, slow and simple, the way grandmothers have told bedtime stories since the beginning of time. Once, a long time ago, there was a terrible winter, the coldest anyone could remember. A mama and her little girl were lost in the snow, and every door was shut against them. Her voice rose and fell with the creak of the swing. The grandchildren drifted closer, fireflies forgotten. Boone thumped his tail in perfect rhythm. Ruth closed her eyes and listened to the story she had lived, tears sliding silent into her smile. When Miss Abby reached the part where Tucker whined and refused to leave the child in the drift, Sadie whispered, "That was the moment he chose us." "And I never argued with Tucker when he chose," Miss Abby finished, just like always. Little Ellie yawned, content. "And they lived happy ever after." "Yes, baby," Miss Abby said, kissing the soft curls. "They surely did." The sun slipped behind the mountains, painting the sky rose and gold. The first star came out, bright and steady. Ruth reached over and took Miss Abby's hand. Sadie laid her head against her grandmother's knee. Boone sighed and stretched, then rested his chin across Miss Abby's feet the same way Tucker once had. The porch swing kept rocking, gentle and slow, carrying them all. Somewhere in the lilac circle, a night breeze stirred the leaves, and if you listened very hard, you could almost hear an old golden dog, thumping his tail one last time, satisfied that the family he had pulled from the snow all those years ago was still together, still safe, still loved beyond measuring. Miss Abby looked up at the starlit sky and whispered so only the night could hear, "Thank you, old friend. We kept the promise." The swing creaked on, the crickets sang, and on that porch, in the circle of lilacs, under Montana stars older than sorrow, 3 generations of McKendrick women and 1 young golden dog rocked together in perfect, quiet, forever peace. And so the porch swing still rocks tonight, carrying 3 generations, 1 old golden dog, and the same quiet miracle that started on the coldest night Montana ever knew. Because sometimes, my dear friends, God doesn't send an army of angels with flaming swords. Sometimes he sends 1 silver-haired woman who's been lonely far too long, 1 big-hearted dog who refuses to walk away, and 1 tiny, freezing child whose life is the only prayer left in her mama's heart. That is the miracle. Not that the storm stopped, but that love walked straight into the storm and said, "Not tonight. These 2 are coming home with me." And if you're watching this tonight, feeling a little cold in your own heart, remember, the same God who melted a Montana blizzard with lilacs and a golden dog is still writing rescue stories today. Maybe the rescue is already on its way to you. In the stranger who smiles too long, in the phone call you almost didn't answer, in the old dog at the shelter who won't stop staring at you. He is still in the business of turning dying nights into forever families. So here's what I ask of you tonight, sweet friends. If this story warmed even 1 small corner of your heart, share it with someone who needs to remember that miracles still happen. Drop a comment below and tell me, where are you watching from tonight? I read every single one, and I pray over every name. And before you close your eyes, may the God who sent Tucker into the snow send his peace into your room right now. May he wrap you warmer than any quilt, guard you better than any golden dog, and whisper the same promise he whispered to a frightened mama long ago. I have not forgotten you. You are coming home. Good night, beloved ones. Sleep deep. The porch light is on, and love is still winning. Hit that subscribe button so we can rock on this swing together again tomorrow. God bless you, everyone. See you in the next story.